The Christmas night that changed everything. When a killer chose to save a life instead of taking it. There are nights that alter the course of everything that follows. That Christmas Eve, in the heart of a Montana blizzard, 3 dying creatures found themselves at an impossible crossroads. A scarred, one-eyed bobcat, a ghost of the wilderness who'd sworn never to enter human territory, a crippled puppy, discarded in a snowbank like yesterday's trash, and a grief-stricken veteran with his finger on the trigger, his rifle scope trained on the predator's skull, ready to end the threat. What happened in the moments that followed would defy every law of nature, every expectation about enemies and allies. This is the true story of courage that needs no words, of sacrifice that makes no sense, and of how one impossible night saved 3 lost souls wandering in the darkness. Because sometimes, the difference between becoming a killer and becoming a savior is just one heartbeat, one choice, one moment when the world holds its breath and waits to see what kind of creature you really are. The wind cut through the Montana valley like a blade made of ice and malice. Shadow moved through the blizzard with the deliberate care of something that had learned long ago that one mistake meant death. His single eye, milky around the edges but still sharp at its core, scanned the white void ahead. The other socket, a puckered scar from a territorial fight years past, had long since stopped aching except when the cold dug too deep. He was hungry. Not the kind of hunger that came after missing a meal, but the hollow, gnawing kind that had been his companion for 3 weeks now. The deer had migrated early this year, driven south by instinct or perhaps by some wisdom that Shadow no longer possessed. The rabbits had burrowed deep. Even the desperate scavenge of a carcass had been denied to him when a younger cat, faster and meaner, had driven him off from a frozen elk he'd found. Shadow's ribs showed through his matted fur like the bars of a prison. Each step through the chest-deep snow cost him energy he couldn't spare. His muscles, once capable of launching him 15 feet onto the back of prey, now trembled with the simple effort of forward motion. He knew what this meant. He had seen it in others of his kind, watched them grow slower, watched them vanish into the white, never to return. The forest offered no sympathy. It never had. Shadow had been born into its indifference, had learned its rules through blood and pain. Weak meant dead. Slow meant dead. Old meant dead. He did not rail against this truth or seek pity from the ice-laden pines that groaned above him. He simply kept moving, because that was what living things did until they stopped. The scent reached him during a brief lull in the wind's howling. Food. Real food, not the phantom memories that sometimes tortured him in his sleep. His nostrils flared, drawing in the information. Chicken, grain, the warm musk of livestock. And beneath it all, something that made his remaining eye narrow with recognition. Gunpowder, oil, human, the Hartley farm. Shadow knew the place, had skirted its boundaries for years, following the invisible treaty that kept wild things wild and human things separate. He had broken that treaty once, 7 winters ago, when desperation had driven him to take a hen. The explosion of the shotgun, the way the fence post next to his head had splintered into 1,000 pieces, had taught him a lesson that had kept him alive. Humans were not prey. Their territory was death. But now, with the storm erasing the world, and his strength fading with each passing hour, the old rules seemed less absolute. Shadow stood at the tree line, his body swaying slightly, and stared down at the distant lights of the farmhouse. Smoke rose from the chimney, a gray column that the wind tore apart and almost immediately. In the barn, in the grain storage, behind those wooden walls, there was food. He took one step forward, then another, The wind picked up again, screaming through the valley, and Shadow let it push him toward the forbidden territory. If he was going to die, it would not be from lack of trying. The ghost of the old woods moved through the white darkness, and for the first time in many years, he broke his own rule. Survival, he had learned, cared nothing for promises made to oneself. The lights of the Hartley farm grew closer. Shadow's single eye reflected them back like a coal in the snow, and he did not slow down. Arthur Hartley sat in the kitchen with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched and a hunting rifle across his lap that he'd cleaned 3 times already. The clock on the wall said it was 4 in the afternoon, but the storm had turned the world so dark it might as well have been midnight. He liked it that way. Darkness didn't ask questions or expect him to pretend things were fine. The rifle was a Winchester, older than most marriages that actually lasted. Sarah had hated the thing, said it made the house feel like a bunker instead of a home. But Sarah had been gone for 2 years now, and the house had become exactly what she'd feared. A place where a man waited for nothing in particular, cleaned weapons he had no intention of using, and let the dust gather on the Christmas decorations boxed up in the attic. He took a drink. The whiskey burned, but it was a clean burn, not like the acid that rose in his throat every time he saw couples in town hanging lights or heard carols playing in the general store. Christmas had become a season that existed solely to remind him of what he'd lost. Sarah had loved it with an enthusiasm that bordered on aggressive. She'd baked cookies for neighbors who barely nodded hello. She'd hung icicle lights that Arthur had to spend 3 days untangling. She'd played the same scratched record of Bing Crosby until Arthur knew every word, every pause, every crackle. Last year he'd spent Christmas Eve sitting in the same chair, staring at her empty one across from him, and had decided then that he was done pretending. No tree, no lights, no forcing himself to smile at the postal workers' cheerful greetings. The holiday could go to hell, and if people in town wanted to whisper about the bitter old veteran who'd let grief turn him mean, let them whisper. The wind hammered against the windows hard enough to rattle the frames. Arthur glanced outside but saw only his own reflection ghosted against the black glass. 60 years old, he looked older. The face staring back at him belonged to someone who'd spent too long in places where comfort was a liability, and trust got people killed. Vietnam had carved lines into him that 40 years of civilian life hadn't smoothed out. Sarah used to trace those lines with her fingers and tell him they made him look distinguished. He'd told her she needed glasses. A sudden gust made the barn door slam, the sound cutting through the storm's constant roar. Arthur's hand tightened on the rifle instinctively, then relaxed. Just the wind. Except the barn door had a latch, and he'd checked it that morning like he checked it every morning, because routine was what kept a man from falling apart completely. He stood, joints protesting, and moved to the window. The exterior light he'd left on by the grain storage illuminated a small circle of the yard, but beyond that was only swirling white. He'd lost 2 chickens last week, found feathers and blood in the snow, the tracks too blurred by wind to identify. Could have been a fox. Could have been that damned Bobcat he'd seen last spring, the big one-eyed bastard that moved through the property like it owned the place. Arthur had shot at it once, more warning than genuine attempt to kill. The cat had looked back at him with that single yellow eye, utterly unconcerned, and then vanished into the brush. The memory still irritated him. He'd been a marksman in the service, could group shots at 300 yards in conditions that made men weep. Missing had been deliberate, but the cat didn't know that, and its casual dismissal felt personal. He returned to his chair and set the whiskey glass down harder than necessary. The clock ticked. The wind screamed. Somewhere in the belly of the storm, something was moving, something was hunting. And Arthur found himself hoping it would come close enough to justify the rage he carried around like a stone in his chest. Not at the animal. Not really. But at the unfairness of a world that had taken a good woman and left him here alone, listening to the sound of his own breathing in an empty house. The light by the grain storage flickered. Arthur's attention snapped back to the window. Through the snow, he saw something. A shape, low to the ground, moving with purpose toward the storage shed. Too big for a fox. Wrong gait for a coyote. The Bobcat. Arthur was on his feet before the thought finished forming. He grabbed the rifle, checked the chamber out of habit, and moved to the back door. His heart, which had been beating its slow, steady rhythm of a man waiting to die, suddenly kicked faster. This was simple. This was clear. Something threatened what was his, and he knew exactly how to respond. He pulled on his coat, not bothering with the zipper, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a fist, but he'd felt worse in the Mekong Delta's mud, in the desert outside Kandahar during his contractor years. Cold was just information. His boots crunched through the snow as he moved toward the storage shed, rifle raised, eye finding the scope's relief automatically. The shape was still there, illuminated in brief moments when the wind shifted. Definitely the Bobcat. Arthur's finger found the trigger, settled into the familiar curve. One shot. That's all it would take. The cat had made its choice coming here, breaking the unspoken boundary. Arthur would make his choice the same way he'd made every choice since Sarah died. Quickly, without sentiment. Because sentiment was what got you hurt. He centered the crosshairs on the cat's skull and began to squeeze. The delivery truck had no business being on County Road 47 in weather like this. But the driver had a quota and a dispatcher who didn't care about excuses. He'd been fighting the wheel for the last 20 miles, his knuckles white, his back soaked with sweat despite the cold. The packages in the back shifted and slid with every turn, and he'd stopped caring about handling protocols around mile marker 12. When he hit the patch of black ice, the truck fishtailed hard enough to send him halfway across the center line. He corrected, overcorrected, and felt the back tires lose their grip entirely. A box tumbled forward from the unsecured pile and wedged itself against his seat. He could hear something inside it making noise. Not the rattle of broken merchandise. Something alive. The driver swore, loud and creative. The kind of profanity that came from too many hours on the road and too little sleep. He didn't have time for whatever this was. The box had been flagged as a return, some idiot customer who changed their mind about a pet ordered online. His instructions had been clear enough. Drop it at the shelter in Billings. But Billings was another 40 miles through this nightmare, and the shelter had probably closed hours ago anyway. He pulled over, or what passed for pulling over when the shoulder disappeared under 3 feet of snow. The box was cardboard, cheap, with holes punched in the sides and a shipping label that had already started to peel. Inside, something whimpered, high and thin, desperate. The driver looked at it, looked at the road ahead, looked at the clock on his dashboard that told him he was already 90 minutes behind schedule. He thought about his warm apartment, about the frozen pizza waiting in his freezer, about the fact that he'd already made 5 runs this week, and his manager had still written him up for a damaged shipment that hadn't even been his fault. He made a decision that took all of 3 seconds. He grabbed the box, shouldered open the door against the wind, and carried it to the ditch. The snow there was deep enough to cushion the fall. The animal would probably die anyway. Exposure, predators, bad luck. But it wouldn't be in his truck anymore. Wouldn't be his problem. And if anyone asked, He'd say it must have fallen out during one of the turns. He set the box down, almost gently, and then walked back to the truck without looking at it again. The engine coughed when he turned the key, coughed again, then caught. He pulled back onto the road, fishtailing slightly, and accelerated into the storm. Within a minute, his taillights had disappeared completely, swallowed by the white. The box sat in the ditch. The wind began to cover it almost immediately, snow piling against one side, then the other. Inside, the puppy cried. It was maybe 8 weeks old, some kind of mixed breed with one back leg that twisted at an angle that wasn't quite right. It had been born that way, and the breeder who'd sold it online had included a note saying it was still healthy, still energetic, just cosmetically imperfect. The customer who'd bought it had taken one look and decided imperfect wasn't what they'd paid for. Now it lay in the cardboard darkness, shivering so hard its tiny body couldn't stop shaking. It didn't understand what had happened. It only knew that it was cold, that it was alone, and that the warmth it had known in its first weeks of life had been replaced by something vast and indifferent. Shadow had been moving parallel to the road when he heard the truck stop. He'd frozen instinctively, becoming just another shadow in the landscape of shadows. His single eye tracked the vehicle, watched the man emerge and deposit something in the ditch, watched him leave. Shadow waited. Nothing in nature moved without reason, and humans were the most unpredictable predators of all. When enough time had passed that he felt certain the truck wouldn't return, Shadow approached. The scent reached him before he reached the box. Young animal. Canine. Fear smell so strong it cut through even the storm's confusion of scents. And underneath it, something else. The smell of a creature that wouldn't survive the night. He circled the box once, then twice. His hunger had driven him toward the farm, but instinct had stopped him here. Food was food, and something small and helpless might be easier than trying to raid a guarded henhouse. He reached out with one paw and tapped the cardboard. It was already soggy with snow, beginning to collapse. Inside, the puppy's crying changed pitch. Not louder, softer. The sound of something giving up. Shadow stood in the storm, the wind pushing at his scarred body, his empty belly a constant ache. From the farmhouse, he could see a light in the window. Could see a shape there, watching. The human had a gun. Shadow knew guns, knew their sound, knew what they did to flesh and bone. But the box was between him and that light, and the sound coming from inside it pulled at something in Shadow's mind. A memory, old and painful. Cubs, his own cubs from years ago, their tiny mewling voices silenced one by cold, by hunger, by the casual cruelty of a world that didn't care how hard you fought. He looked at the farmhouse, looked at the box, made his choice. Shadow's claws tore through the wet cardboard with casual efficiency, and the interior of the box lay exposed to the storm. The puppy looked up at Shadow with eyes that didn't understand death yet. Its fur was matted and wet, the color of mud and snow mixed together, and that crooked back leg stuck out at an angle that made Shadow's predator brain register it immediately as weakness. Easy prey, the kind nature culled without hesitation. Shadow's jaws opened. His teeth, yellowed but still sharp, could crush the small skull in a single bite. It would be quick, merciful even, compared to what the cold would do. He lowered his head. The puppy didn't run, couldn't run with that leg. It just looked at him and made a sound that was barely a whimper, more like a sigh, like it had expected this, like it had already accepted that the world was a place where warm things disappeared and cold things came to take you. Shadow stopped. His breath came out in clouds that wreathed the puppy's small body. That sound, that resignation. He knew it, had heard it in his own throat the night his cubs died, when he'd returned to the den to find them stiff and cold. When he'd understood that all his hunting, all his fighting, all his strength had meant nothing against a late spring freeze. The memory hit him with physical force. He'd curled around those tiny bodies for hours, trying to give them warmth they could no longer receive, trying to will life back into flesh that had already started its journey toward the earth. When he'd finally accepted they were gone, he'd left that den and never returned, had sworn, in whatever way a wild thing swears, that he would never allow himself to care about anything that fragile again. But here was fragility, trembling in front of him. Here was something that wouldn't survive the next hour without intervention. And here was Shadow, who should have learned by now that survival meant looking out only for yourself, that sentiment was a luxury predators couldn't afford. He looked back toward the farmhouse. Through the scope of the rifle, he could see the human's eye, could sense the finger on the trigger, the decision being weighed. One shot. That's all it would take to end him, and maybe that would be fine. Maybe that would be easier than continuing this slow stagger toward death. Shadow looked down at the puppy again, at the crooked leg, at the eyes that had already given up. Then he lay down. It wasn't a gentle movement. Shadow didn't know gentle. He simply folded his legs and dropped his body into the snow beside the box, close enough that his bulk blocked the wind. The puppy flinched, then went still, sensing perhaps that if death was coming, fighting wouldn't stop it. But death didn't come. Instead, warmth did. Shadow's fur, thick despite his malnourishment, held heat the way it had evolved to do through 1,000 generations of mountain winters. He shifted slightly, curling his body into a loose semicircle, and the puppy, operating on instinct older than thought, crawled toward that warmth. It pressed against Shadow's belly, that twisted leg dragging uselessly through the snow. It burrowed into his fur, seeking something it couldn't name but needed the way drowning things need air. And Shadow, who had survived by being hard, by being merciless, by never hesitating when hesitation meant death, lay perfectly still and let it happen. From the farmhouse, Arthur's finger remained frozen on the trigger. His eye hadn't left the scope, but what he was seeing didn't make sense. The bobcat should have killed it by now. Should have torn it apart, scattered its remains, moved on. That's what predators did. That's what they were built for. Instead, the cat was doing something Arthur's mind struggled to categorize, protecting it. No, more than that. Sheltering it. The way a mother would. The way Sarah used to pull him close during storms, her body a barrier between him and whatever darkness lived in his head. Arthur's hands started to shake. Not from the cold, from something he didn't have words for. The crosshairs wavered, lost their target, found it again. He should shoot. The cat was a threat, had always been a threat. This changed nothing. But his finger wouldn't complete the pull, wouldn't finish what he'd started. Because in that moment, watching a half-starved predator choose mercy over survival, Arthur saw something that looked too much like courage, too much like grace, too much like everything he'd thought died with Sarah. The wind howled. The snow fell. And in the space between heartbeats, 3 lives hung suspended in a moment that could break any direction. 1 bullet, 1 choice, 1 second that would determine whether the ghost of the old woods would see another dawn. Arthur lowered the rifle slowly, his breath coming out in short bursts that had nothing to do with the cold. He stepped back from the window, set the Winchester against the wall, and stood there in his kitchen, feeling like a man who just watched something impossible. The logical part of his brain, the part trained by years of military discipline, tried to catalog what he'd seen in terms that made sense. Animal behavior, instinct, some kind of confusion brought on by the storm. But he knew what he'd witnessed. Recognition, choice, the same things that separated men from monsters, and apparently separated some animals from others too. He should go inside, pour another whiskey, let nature take whatever course it was going to take. The cat would probably leave once the storm died down. The puppy would freeze or it wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't his concern. He'd spent 2 years learning how to turn concern into indifference, how to make it through days by simply not caring about anything beyond the basic mechanics of survival. Yet his hand was already reaching for his coat, already checking the pocket for the flashlight he kept there, already betraying him. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees by the time full darkness settled over the valley. Shadow felt it in his bones, in the old wound on his shoulder that never quite healed right, in the way his muscles wanted to lock up and refuse to move. The puppy had stopped shivering, which Shadow's instincts recognized as dangerous. When prey stopped fighting the cold, death came quick. He shifted his weight, pulling the small body closer, tucking it deeper into the space beneath his ribcage. The puppy stirred slightly, made a sound that might have been contentment or might have been the last confused murmur before shutting down entirely. Shadow's ear twitched, tracking sounds through the storm. Wind, the creak of trees bending under ice, his own heartbeat slower than it should be. Then something else, multiple somethings, moving through the snow with the distinctive rhythm of canines on the hunt. Shadow's head came up fast. His single eye caught the reflection first, 3 sets of them, spaced apart but moving in coordination. Yellow-green in the darkness, getting closer. The scent hit him a moment later and confirmed what he already knew. Coyotes, a hunting pack, small but desperate enough to be in motion during a blizzard. They'd probably smelled the puppy's fear from half a mile away, followed it like a beacon. Now they were coming in, cautious but committed, drawn by the promise of easy meat. Shadow pulled himself to his feet. Every joint protested, every muscle screamed that he was too old for this, too weak, too damaged. The puppy rolled slightly as he moved, made a sound of distress at the loss of warmth. Shadow positioned himself between it and the approaching threat, his body low, his remaining eye locked on the nearest pair of glowing circles. The first coyote emerged from the white curtain of snow, like a ghost materializing. It was young, maybe 2 years old, lean with hunger but still strong. Its lips pulled back from its teeth in what wasn't quite a snarl, more like a question. The message was clear enough. Move aside. This doesn't have to be a fight. Shadow's answer was a rumble that started deep in his chest and built into something that made the coyote hesitate. It was the sound of a creature that had nothing left to lose, that had already made peace with death and was now only negotiating the terms. The second coyote appeared to the left, then the third to the right. They were surrounding him, using tactics as old as pack hunting itself. Shadow turned, his head trying to keep all 3 in his field of vision, knowing it was impossible. His blind side was a weakness they'd exploit the moment they decided to commit. The puppy whimpered behind him, small, helpless, the kind of sound that triggered every predator's instinct to strike. Shadow felt his muscles coiling, preparing for something he probably wouldn't survive. He thought briefly that this was a stupid way to die, that he should have let nature take its course, should have eaten the puppy himself, should have stayed focused on his own survival the way he'd always done. But he didn't move, didn't step aside, just lowered his head and waited for them to make their decision. The lead coyote took one step forward, then another, testing. Behind Shadow, the puppy's breathing had become so shallow it was almost imperceptible. Above them, the storm continued its assault on the world, indifferent to the small drama playing out in its shadow. The coyote's haunches tensed, preparing to spring. Shadow's claws dug into the frozen earth, and somewhere in the darkness, a door opened, spilling light across the snow. The lead coyote struck first, coming in low and fast the way pack hunters do when they've identified the weak side of their prey. Shadow twisted, but his old body betrayed him with a half-second delay that would have been nothing in his prime, and was everything now. Teeth found purchase in his shoulder, the same shoulder that had never healed right, and pain, white-hot and familiar, exploded through his nervous system. Shadow's response was pure instinct, rage. He threw his weight sideways, using mass instead of speed, and felt the coyote stumble. His own jaws found fur and flesh, closed hard, tasted blood. The coyote yelped and released, dancing back, but the other two were already moving. They came from both sides simultaneously, the way wolves take down elk, the way any intelligent pack brings down something bigger than themselves. Shadow felt teeth sink into his haunch, felt claws rake across his ribs. He spun, dislodged one attacker, but the movement left him exposed, and the third coyote lunged for his throat. Shadow dropped low at the last instant, took the bite on his neck instead of his windpipe, felt skin tear, but nothing vital rupture. He rolled, came up facing all three again, and in the brief pause before the next assault, he realized with cold certainty that this was how it ended. Not from starvation, not from the cold, but here, fighting for something that made no practical sense to fight for. The puppy was crying now, a thin wail that cut through the wind. Shadow backed up until his haunches touched the collapsed cardboard box, until there was nowhere left to retreat. Blood ran hot down his shoulder, his leg, matting his fur, steaming in the frigid air. The coyotes circled, more cautious now that they'd tasted his willingness to hurt them back, but patient. They had time. He didn't. The lead coyote feinted left, and when Shadow tracked the movement, the one on his blind side charged. Shadow felt rather than saw it coming, turned too late, took the impact in his ribs hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. He went down, rolling instinctively to protect his belly, and suddenly all three were on him. A confusion of teeth and snarls, and the hot breath of predators who'd stopped being cautious and committed fully to the kill. Shadow fought like something possessed. His claws opened gashes, his teeth found throats and ears and anything close enough to damage. But there were three of them, and one of him. And they were young and hungry while he was old, and already bleeding from half a dozen wounds. He felt himself being pushed back, until he was literally on top of the puppy, his body the last barrier between it and death. A coyote's jaws closed on his front leg, pulled hard, trying to drag him off his prize. Shadow's vision was starting to gray at the edges. Whether from blood loss or exhaustion, he couldn't tell. His remaining eye fixed on the leader, the one that was circling toward the puppy's exposed side. And Shadow knew he didn't have the strength left to stop it. He managed one last growl, weaker than before, more plea than threat. The puppy's crying had stopped. It was either unconscious or dead, and Shadow found himself hoping for dead, hoping it wouldn't feel what came next. The lead coyote tensed for the final lunge. Shadow's legs trembled, barely holding his weight. This was it. The moment. He'd fought well. Sarah would have been proud of how hard he'd tried, how long he'd lasted against odds no sensible creature would have faced. Then the night exploded with sound. The gunshot wasn't aimed at anything living, but the noise was catastrophic in the storm's relative quiet. a crack that sent snow cascading from nearby branches and turned the coyotes' coordinated attack into instant chaos. They scattered, not away but sideways, confused, their pack mentality fracturing under the assault of something their instincts couldn't process. A second shot followed, this one even louder, and Shadow's remaining ear registered a human voice screaming words he didn't understand, but recognized the tone of. Aggression. Territory. The same things he'd been communicating, just in a different language. The coyotes made their decision in the space between heartbeats. They ran, vanishing into the storm as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving only tracks and blood and the lingering scent of their presence. Shadow tried to stand, managed to get his front legs under him, then collapsed again. His vision swam. His lungs pulled air that felt like fire. Through the haze, he saw the human approaching. The one from the farm. The one with the gun. Shadow's lip curled in what should have been a warning, but came out as barely a tremor. He tried to position himself over the puppy one more time, tried to show that he'd keep fighting, but his body had finally reached its limit. The human stopped a few feet away. Shadow could smell him now. Whiskey and old grief and gun oil. Could see the weapon in his hands, still smoking slightly, barrel pointed at the sky. Could see something in the man's face that Shadow had no framework for understanding, but recognized anyway. The man was crying. Arthur hadn't planned to fire the gun, hadn't planned to leave the house at all. But something about watching that cat stand its ground against three younger, stronger predators had bypassed every rational thought in his head and triggered something deeper. Something that remembered what it meant to hold a line when retreating made more sense. Something that recognized courage, even when it wore fur and fangs. Now he stood in the snow with smoke still curling from the Winchester's barrel, looking down at his enemy. The Bobcat was a mess. Blood matted its fur in at least 4 places that Arthur could see, probably more underneath. Its breathing came in shallow gasps that fogged the air between them. That single yellow eye tracked him with perfect clarity despite the obvious pain, and the message in it was unmistakable. Come closer and die trying. Behind the cat, mostly hidden by its body, the puppy lay motionless. Arthur couldn't tell if it was alive or not. Couldn't tell if any of this had been worth it. The cat had fought like it mattered, like protecting this random scrap of life was worth bleeding out in the snow for. And Arthur understood that kind of stupid better than he wanted to admit. He lowered the rifle slowly, deliberately, keeping his movements visible. The cat's growl decreased in volume, but didn't stop. Its front legs trembled with the effort of staying upright. Arthur had seen that look before, in the mirror mostly, on days when getting out of bed felt like scaling Everest, but you did it anyway, because the alternative was admitting defeat. Easy, Arthur said, his voice rough from disuse and cold. I'm not here to hurt you. The cat didn't speak English and wouldn't have trusted him if it did. Its claws dug deeper into the frozen earth, body tensing for one last fight it clearly didn't have the strength for. Arthur recognized that too. The moment when all you had left was defiance, when your body was done, but your mind refused to accept it. He thought about Sarah, about the last weeks when the cancer had eaten her down to nothing but will, when she'd still tried to smile, still tried to tell him she'd be fine, still tried to protect him from a truth they both knew. He'd held her hand and lied back, told her the doctors were optimistic, told her they'd have another Christmas, told her whatever she needed to hear because sometimes lies were the kindest thing you could offer. Looking at this cat, this stubborn, broken ghost of the wild, Arthur saw the same thing. Something fighting past all reason, past all hope, simply because giving up wasn't in its nature, He set the rifle down in the snow, raised his hands, palms out, the universal gesture of surrender or peace or whatever you wanted to call it, when predators decided not to kill each other. The cat watched him, suspicious. That eye never blinking, never giving an inch of ground, even though ground was all it had left to give. "You're going to die out here," Arthur said quietly. "Both of you. You know that, right? You fought good. Better than good. But it's over." The cat's response was a sound that might have been agreement or might have been defiance. Arthur couldn't tell. Didn't matter. He turned and walked back toward the house, his boots crunching through snow that was already filling in the tracks of the fight. He didn't look back. Didn't need to. He knew the cat would stay put, would guard its worthless prize until the cold or the blood loss finished what the coyotes had started. Arthur reached the porch, climbed the steps, opened the door to his kitchen, where the warmth and the whiskey waited. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at his empty house, at Sarah's chair, at the calendar on the wall that still showed November because he hadn't bothered to turn it, at the life he'd built that consisted of waiting for nothing in particular. Then he turned around, walked to the grain storage shed, and opened the door wide. The interior was warmer than outside, not by much, but enough. Dry hay covered the floor. He flicked on the overhead light, found a wool blanket he kept for emergencies, spread it in the corner, grabbed a metal bowl from the shelf, walked back to the kitchen, filled it with water. Found the leftover chicken from 2 nights ago, the roast that had been meant for him and Sarah before there was only him, cut it into pieces and put them in a second bowl. He carried both bowls to the shed, set them down near the blanket, then walked back out into the storm. The cat was still there, still somehow upright, still positioned over the puppy like a monument to something Arthur didn't have words for. Their eyes met across the space between them. "It's warm," Arthur said, jerking his head toward the open shed door. "Got food, water. You can die in there just as easy as out here, but at least you'll be comfortable." The cat didn't move. Arthur hadn't expected it to. He stood there for another moment, then turned and walked toward his house. Got halfway there before he stopped, looked back one more time. The cat was watching him, still suspicious, still ready to fight. But something in its posture had shifted. Some small fraction of tension had released. Arthur nodded once, a gesture of respect between old soldiers, and went inside. He left his kitchen light on, left the shed door open, poured himself that whiskey he'd been meaning to drink for hours, and sat in his chair by the window, watching the storm and the faint silhouette of a predator making an impossible choice. Shadow waited until the human's footsteps faded completely before he allowed himself to acknowledge how badly he was hurt. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fight was draining away, leaving behind a landscape of pain that stretched from his shoulder to his haunch. Every breath pulled at torn muscle. Every heartbeat pushed more blood into the snow beneath him. The puppy stirred against his belly, a small movement that shouldn't have registered, but did. Still alive then. Shadow had bought it time, though for what purpose he couldn't say. In the wild, the deformed didn't survive. That was law, written in tooth and claw across millennia. Yet here he was, bleeding out to protect exactly the kind of weakness nature was designed to eliminate. He looked at the open shed door. Light spilled from it, warm and yellow, completely unlike the cold white of the storm. The human had left it open deliberately, had put something inside. Shadow's nose, even compromised by blood and exhaustion, caught the scent of food. Real food. Not the desperate scraps he'd been surviving on, but meat with fat still on it, the kind that could restore strength if you lived long enough to digest it. It was a trap. Had to be. Humans didn't help. Didn't offer shelter and sustenance without expecting something in return. Shadow had learned that lesson watching his kind disappear into cages, into the backs of trucks, into situations they never returned from. But his legs were giving out. The blood loss was making his vision tunnel, making the world shrink down to just the circle of light from that open door and the darkness pressing in from every other direction. He could stay here and freeze with dignity, or he could drag himself into whatever waited inside that shed and at least die warm. Shadow made his choice the way he'd made every choice that kept him alive this long. Pragmatically, without sentiment. He closed his jaws carefully around the puppy's scruff, the way mother cats carried kittens, and started the long journey toward the light. Each step was negotiation. His wounded leg didn't want to bear weight. His shoulder screamed protest every time he shifted the puppy's minimal mass. He fell twice, the second time hard enough that he thought he might not get back up. But the puppy whimpered, that tiny sound of distress cutting through his pain. And Shadow found himself standing again, moving again, because apparently he decided that this ridiculous creature's survival mattered more than his own comfort. The shed's interior was everything the storm wasn't. Dry. Still. The hay under his paws felt soft in a way he'd forgotten existed. Shadow set the puppy down on the blanket the human had left, then collapsed beside it, his legs finally giving up their attempt to hold him upright. The puppy immediately tried to burrow into him again, seeking warmth, seeking comfort, seeking things Shadow had no business providing. He curled around it anyway, his body moving on instincts that predated thought. The bowl of water was close enough to reach. He lapped at it, weakly, felt the cold liquid soothe his throat, tasted nothing foreign or dangerous. The meat was there too, cut into pieces small enough that he didn't need to tear them. Shadow ate, not because he trusted the human, but because his body demanded fuel and pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. The food settled in his empty stomach like an anchor, heavy and real and exactly what he needed. The puppy tried to eat too, managed a few licks of water before exhaustion pulled it back into sleep. In the house, Arthur watched through his kitchen window. He'd pulled a chair up, positioned himself where he could see the shed without being obvious about it. The whiskey sat untouched on the table beside him. He didn't need it anymore. The numbness he'd been chasing for 2 years had been replaced by something else. Something that felt dangerously close to purpose. He saw the exact moment when the cat finally surrendered to sleep. Saw the way its body relaxed incrementally. Saw the tension drain from muscles that had been coiled for so long they'd probably forgotten what rest felt like. The puppy was already out, curled so tight against the cat's stomach that it was hard to tell where one animal ended and the other began. Arthur sat there for a long time, just watching. The storm continued outside, but inside the shed, 2 impossibly fragile lives had found temporary refuge. It didn't fix anything. Didn't bring Sarah back, didn't erase the 2 years of grief, didn't make Christmas feel like anything other than a reminder of everything he'd lost. But it was something. A small thing. Maybe a stupid thing. But in that moment, watching a predator and its accidental ward sleep in the shelter he'd provided, Arthur felt the first crack in the ice that had formed around whatever part of him used to care about things beyond his own survival. He finished the whiskey after all, but not for the reasons he usually did. This time it was a toast to the stupid and the stubborn, to the things that fought past sense and reason, to whatever force in the universe made an old soldier save an old cat, save a broken puppy on Christmas Eve. Outside, the storm finally began to ease. The wind's howling dropped to a whisper. Snow continued falling, but softer now, like the world was laying a blanket over everything harsh and settling in for the long winter night. In the grain shed, Shadow's breathing steadied into the rhythm of healing sleep. In the house, Arthur felt his own eyes growing heavy. For the first time in 730 days, he didn't dread tomorrow. Arthur woke on Christmas morning to silence. Not the oppressive silence of isolation he'd grown accustomed to, but something different. The kind that came after storms, when the world took a breath and reassessed itself. He made coffee without thinking about it, his body moving through the routine while his mind stayed fixed on the shed outside. He checked on them twice during the night. Once at 2 a.m., the morning when he couldn't sleep, and again at dawn when the sky started turning from black to gray. Both times the cat had been awake, watching him from the darkness with that single eye, but it hadn't growled, hadn't threatened, just watched. The way soldiers watched each other across no man's land during temporary truces. The puppy had slept through both visits, its small chest rising and falling with a regularity that suggested it might actually survive. Arthur had noticed the twisted leg, had understood immediately why someone had dumped it in a ditch. People wanted perfection in their pets, wanted Instagram-worthy companions that reflected well on them. They didn't want reminders that the world produced broken things. He poured his coffee and stood at the window. The sun was coming up properly now, turning the snow-covered valley into something out of a postcard. Beautiful in that way that hid the danger underneath. You could freeze to death in scenery this pretty, and your corpse would look peaceful when they found it in spring. By the 3rd day after the storm, Shadow could walk without his legs threatening to buckle. The wounds were closing, healing with the stubborn efficiency of an animal that had survived worse. Arthur had cleaned them that second morning, moving slow and steady while the cat watched him with suspicion but didn't bite. Had applied antibiotic ointment from his veterinary supplies, left over from when he used to keep more livestock than just a few chickens. The puppy had woken up properly on day 2, and that's when things got complicated. It had discovered its voice, a high-pitched sound that made Arthur wince and made Shadow's ears flatten. But more than that, it had discovered Shadow, had started following the cat around the shed, dragging that crooked leg, tumbling over itself in its eagerness to stay close to the thing that had saved it. Shadow tolerated this with the patience of something that had long ago accepted that life made no sense. He let the puppy sleep against him, let it lick his face with its small tongue, let it stumble after him when he moved to drink a water or eat the food Arthur kept replenishing. Arthur watched this with a fascination he couldn't quite name, this unlikely partnership between predator and prey. On the morning of the 4th day, Arthur opened the shed door to find Shadow standing at the threshold, looking out at the forest beyond. The cat had been facing this direction for an hour, Arthur knew, because he'd been watching from the kitchen. The wounds had healed enough. The strength had returned enough. Shadow was ready to leave. The puppy sat beside him, confused, sensing something was happening but not understanding what. It had started responding to the name Arthur had given it. Lucky, not particularly creative, but it fit. The puppy was lucky to be alive, lucky that Shadow had found it, lucky that Arthur had decided to care for once instead of just existing. Arthur walked out across the snow, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. Shadow turned to look at him, and Arthur stopped a respectful distance away. They regarded each other, man and beast, enemy and ally, two creatures who'd somehow ended up on the same side of a fight neither had been looking for. "You're leaving," Arthur said. Not a question, He could see it in the way Shadow held himself, the way his body was oriented toward the tree line like a compass finding north. Lucky whimpered, pushed closer to Shadow, tried to follow when the cat took one step forward. Shadow stopped, looked down at the puppy, and something passed between them that Arthur couldn't translate but understood anyway. This is goodbye. Shadow lowered his head, pressed his scarred muzzle against Lucky's small face, a gesture so tender it made Arthur's throat tight. The puppy licked the cat's nose, tail wagging despite the confusion in its eyes. Shadow held there for a long moment, then pulled away and looked at Arthur. Their eyes met, yellow and blue, wild and tame. Arthur saw recognition there, saw respect, saw something that looked almost like gratitude, though he knew better than to project human emotions onto a predator. He raised his hand slowly, brought it to his forehead in a proper military salute, the kind he hadn't given since his discharge 40 years ago. Shadow held his gaze for 3 more heartbeats. Then he turned and ran. Not the slow, painful movement of 3 days ago, but something closer to what he'd been before age and injury had taken their toll. He moved through the snow like smoke, like his name, like everything wild and untamable, and within seconds he'd vanished into the forest as completely as if he'd never existed. Lucky tried to follow, made it maybe 10 feet before the snow in his crooked leg conspired against him. He sat down hard, letting out a sound that was pure heartbreak, looking at the place where Shadow had disappeared. Arthur walked over, bent down, scooped the puppy up. Lucky trembled in his arms, still staring at the forest, still hoping. Arthur understood that too, hoping for things that weren't coming back, waiting for people who'd already gone. He'd been doing it for 2 years. "He's not coming back, buddy," Arthur said quietly. "That's not how it works. He's wild. He belongs out there." Lucky finally looked at him, brown eyes wet and confused. Arthur carried him back toward the house, toward warmth and food and safety, all the things humans could offer that wild things couldn't accept. Behind them, the forest stood silent, keeping its secrets. Shadow was gone, returned to the place he'd come from, and Arthur felt the weight of that absence like a stone. But when he looked down at Lucky, at this broken thing that had somehow survived impossible odds, he felt something else too. Not replacement, not substitution, but maybe the beginning of understanding that saving one life, even imperfectly, mattered more than he'd let himself believe. The following Christmas came with less snow but more light. Arthur stood on his porch, coffee steaming in the cold air, watching Lucky chase his own tail in the yard. The dog had grown, filled out despite the leg that would never straighten, moved with a rolling gait that was equal parts determination and stubbornness. He'd become something Arthur hadn't expected. Not a pet exactly, but a companion. The kind that didn't ask questions about your past or judge you for the days when getting out of bed felt like climbing mountains. The house looked different this year. Arthur had strung lights along the porch rail, not the elaborate display Sarah used to insist on, but enough that it didn't look like a place where hope had gone to die. Inside, a small tree stood in the corner, decorated with ornaments he'd found in the attic and a few new ones he'd bought in town. The postal worker had commented on them, said it was good to see him joining the living again. Arthur had just nodded, not knowing how to explain that it wasn't about joining so much as remembering how. Lucky had done that. The dog's simple presence, his uncomplicated need for food and warmth and attention, had pulled Arthur out of the spiral he'd been circling for 2 years. You couldn't wallow in self-pity when something depended on you for survival. Couldn't spend all day staring at empty chairs when a dog needed walking, feeding, playing with. Life, Arthur had discovered, insisted on itself, even when you'd given it permission to stop. He'd thought about Shadow often during those 12 months. Wondered if the old cat had survived the winter, if his wounds had healed properly, if he'd found enough food in the lean months. Arthur liked to think he had, liked to imagine that stubborn ghost still moving through the forest, still fighting for one more day. But he'd made peace with not knowing. Wild things didn't send postcards or updates. They either survived or they didn't. And you learned to accept the uncertainty. Lucky suddenly stopped his playing and went rigid, the way he did when he sensed something Arthur's aging senses missed. His ears perked forward, pointing toward the tree line like antennae. Then he barked, not the warning bark he used for strangers or the excited bark for squirrels, but something different. Recognition, maybe, or memory. Arthur set down his coffee and followed as Lucky took off toward the forest edge, his crooked leg barely slowing him down. The dog had learned to compensate, to use his other 3 legs in ways that made the 4th almost irrelevant. He moved with purpose now, headed for a specific spot where the pines grew thick and the shadows stayed deep even at midday. Arthur caught up to find Lucky sitting at attention, tail wagging so hard his whole back end shook. The dog was staring up at an outcropping of rock that overlooked the valley, and Arthur followed his gaze. Shadow sat there, not crouched, not hiding, but sitting tall and visible, his single eye reflecting the morning sun. He looked better than Arthur remembered. The scars were still there, always would be, but the starvation thinness had filled out. His coat had a sheen to it that spoke of successful hunts, of prey caught and consumed, of a predator back at the top of his game. But he wasn't alone. To Shadow's right sat a female bobcat, slightly smaller, her coat unmarked by the battle scars that decorated her mate. And at their feet, wrestling with each other in the snow, 2 kits tumbled and played, young enough that they hadn't yet learned the caution that kept wild things alive. Arthur felt something catch in his chest. Shadow had survived, had done more than survive, had found a mate, had produced offspring, had done what nature demanded of its successful predators. The bloodline would continue. The ghost of the old woods had secured his legacy. Lucky whined, a sound of pure longing, wanting to climb up there and rejoin the creature that had saved his life. Shadow looked down at him, and for a moment, Arthur could have sworn the cat's expression softened. Not much, just a fraction, the way ice cracks in spring thaw. Then Shadow turned his attention to Arthur. Their eyes met across the distance. Arthur felt the weight of that gaze, the intelligence behind it, the memory of that night when everything had changed. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand again in that same salute. Respect between old soldiers. Acknowledgement between survivors. Shadow held his position for a long moment. Let Arthur see what he'd accomplished. Let him understand that the intervention had mattered. Then he stood, turned, and moved back into the deeper shadows, his family following. The female went first, then the kits, tumbling over each other in their eagerness. Shadow paused at the tree line, looked back one final time, then vanished. Lucky whimpered again, but it was different now. Not heartbreak, but acceptance. He leaned against Arthur's leg, looking up at him with those brown eyes that held more understanding than any dog should possess. Arthur reached down and scratched behind his ears. "He came to say thank you," Arthur said quietly, "and to show us he's okay. That's more than most ghosts manage." They stood there for a while, man and dog, looking at the empty rocks where a family of predators had briefly revealed themselves. The sun climbed higher, warming the valley, melting the frost from the pine branches. Somewhere in the distance, A hawk cried out, and Lucky's ears tracked it automatically. Arthur thought about Sarah, about how she would have loved this story, would have cried at the parts about sacrifice and redeemed at the reunion. She'd always believed in second chances, in the possibility of healing, in the stubborn resilience of things that refused to give up. He'd thought those beliefs died with her, but maybe they'd just been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake. "Come on, buddy," Arthur said, turning back toward the house. "Let's get you some breakfast." Lucky followed, his limp pronounced in the cold, but his spirit undimmed. As they walked, Arthur looked back one more time at the forest. The trees stood silent, keeping their secrets, hiding their ghosts. But Arthur knew now what lived in those shadows. Knew that survival wasn't always pretty or perfect. That sometimes the broken things were the strongest. That choosing to care could save more than just the thing you cared for. Inside the house, the Christmas lights twinkled. The tree stood decorated. The coffee was still hot. Arthur poured Lucky's breakfast, watching the dog attack it with the enthusiasm of something that remembered hunger and never took food for granted. He made himself eggs and toast, ate them at the table where Sarah's chair still sat empty, but no longer felt like an accusation. Outside, the Montana winter continued its work, cold and indifferent and beautiful. In the forest, Shadow moved through his territory with his family, teaching his kits the skills they'd need to survive. In the farmhouse, Arthur planned his day around the needs of a three-legged dog. And somewhere between the wild and the tame, in the space where predators and protectors occasionally found common ground, the memory of one impossible night lingered like smoke. "We don't save things to make them ours," Arthur thought, watching Lucky settle in by the fireplace. "We save them so they can keep being what they were meant to be. Kings of the old woods, ghosts in the snow, wild things that choose just once to be something more." The thought felt like wisdom, felt like something Sarah would have said, felt, most importantly, like truth. Outside, fresh snow began to fall. The snow kept falling that Christmas, just like it does every winter in Montana. But something had changed in that valley. 3 lives that should have ended found a reason to keep going. And sometimes, that's all any of us need. One moment that reminds us why we fight, why we care, why we choose to keep moving forward even when everything tells us to give up. Shadow returned to his forest, not as a ghost waiting to fade away, but as a king reclaiming his throne. Lucky found a home with a man who needed him just as much as he needed that home. And Arthur? He learned that saving something doesn't mean owning it. It means giving it the chance to be exactly what it was meant to be. I'd love to hear what this story meant to you. Have you ever witnessed an unlikely friendship between animals? Or maybe you've had a moment when a pet came into your life exactly when you needed them most. Drop a comment below and share your story. I read every single one, and your experiences matter. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button. We share true stories like this every week. Stories about resilience, courage, and the unexpected moments that change everything. Stories that remind us we're all connected, whether we have 2 legs, 4 legs, or even just 3. Thank you for spending this time with Shadow, Lucky, and Arthur. Their story is over, but yours continues. Make it a good one. Until next time, take care of each other out there.